How you decide to specialize has been covered pretty well elsewhere in this course. So in this lecture, we'll go deep on what positioning and specialization are. Let's start by understanding the idea of market position. A market position is literally where you are in the market. And we can try to depict this. So we'll create a simplified world where two things matter in the market: price and user privacy. And we'll map this world using the business person's favorite map, the 2x2. Let's map two companies' products on this map. We'll choose companies that are really different from each other. We'll choose Apple and Facebook. Here's how I would place Apple and Facebook on this 2x2. Facebook achieves their business model by taking a pretty loose view of privacy, or sacrificing privacy for what they call connection. So it is a bit unfair to say that they lose along this dimension of privacy compared to a company like Apple or anyone else. Apple has the benefit of their business model not depending 100% on a loose view of privacy, so it makes it easier for them to, quote, win along the dimension of privacy, to have more privacy than Facebook. But this does make our larger point about how companies can be compared along multiple axes and how they might differ or alternately compete to be known for the same attributes. This is a really important part of the idea of market position. This also illustrates that, to a certain extent, companies decide to emphasize or de-emphasize or ignore certain attributes of their offerings. In other words, companies make choices about what they want to be known for. In a way, this is all about choosing what game you want to play. If we asked 100 people to fill out this 2x2 for Apple and Facebook, and then we overlaid everyone's version onto a single 2x2, it might look something like this. Now, you'll have to excuse my inability to clearly show 100 actual icons for each of these two companies, but I think you get the point. It's obvious that we would never end up with the same 2x2 placement for every human. But if it's consistent-ish, if it's mostly consistent how all these 100 people see these two companies, then we have what we call a market position. If enough people place or position a business in basically the same place on this 2x2, then that company occupies that market position. It's critical to notice whose minds matter in defining a market position. It is the minds of the people in the market. Those are the minds that matter. Without the minds of the people inside the company, there'd be no product, there'd be no company. So those minds do matter too, but the minds that define a market position are the minds of the people in the market. Our 2x2 grid defines two competitive attributes: privacy and price. In reality, the minds of the people in the market often care about more than just two attributes of a product or a company. Here, we're looking at something called a blue ocean strategy canvas. This proposes one way that you could visualize more than two competitive attributes. No single mind defines a market position. In this way, a market position and a brand are very similar. There are zillions of definitions for the marketing concept of brand. If we try to categorize them, there are functionally oriented definitions. So we think of a brand as a synonym for a company. Maybe we think of it as a legal instrument. Maybe we just simply think of it as a logo or a visual identity. Those are all functionally oriented definitions. What does a brand do? And there are experientially oriented definitions of a brand. So some folks will say a brand is a risk reducer for customers, or it's the personality of the company, or it's an image in the consumer's mind, or it's a relationship between the company and all their customers. Those are more experientially oriented definitions. Many of those experientially oriented definitions of brand focus on the stuff that exists in the mind of the people in the market, the customers, the consumers. So this is why if you squint a little bit, a market position and a brand kind of look like the same thing. There's another thing that exists in the minds of people in the market, a reputation. Again, if we squint a bit, a market position, a brand, and a person or company's reputation look remarkably similar. The differences are really more our connotations and assumptions about those words than anything else. Reputation has a very personal connotation, so we often use the word reputation to talk about how a person is perceived by a larger group of people or a market. But if that person has a really huge reach, if a lot of people know about them, we do tend to refer to them as a brand or a personal brand. Reputation is very similar to the idea of track record. Both of those ideas are focused on how past performance and behavior reflects on whether we can trust someone and what we can expect of them in the future. A person's market position is also partly defined by what they've done in the past. It's also partly defined by what they choose to say about themselves and their business. So a market position is not 100% backwards focusing the way a track record or a reputation would be. I wish I could give simple, unambiguous definitions for the words brand, market position, and reputation, but they have these sort of subtle and varying shades of meaning, so I can't just clearly, precisely define them. You should note that you cannot download a desired market position into the minds of the entire market or even a single person's mind. You cannot cause the market to think of you or your business in exactly the way that you desire. You just can't. You can't do mass brainwashing of the entire market so that they think of your business in the way that you want to. That raises the question, how do you build up a market position? You build up a market position by deciding what reputation you want and then doing the work of earning that reputation. I know that's a somewhat simple, oversimplified circular definition, but that's basically how it works. You might, along the way, refine your idea of the reputation you want, iterate that idea, or further tweak it. That's fine, but basically you imagine a future state where you have some kind of reputation, and then you do the work of earning that reputation. The best word for the result of that process is market position, or maybe reputation. The best word for the starting point of that process is you have made a decision to specialize, or we could simply say specialization, or you specialized. That's the starting point. That's what starts the process. So essentially, when you specialize, you are deciding what future reputation you want. That's the decision, and then there's work that follows that to implement that decision. A clever way to put this would be to say that you specialize in creating the kind of reputation that you want. That's a perhaps overly clever way to say it. Normally, we think of it slightly differently. We specialize in something we want to be known for. You could also notice that you specialize in something that you want to be good at, so good at it that you create exceptional value in the marketplace. You probably want to specialize in something that you enjoy doing sufficiently to keep investing in the expertise. But essentially, you specialize in the thing that you want to be known for. That's what specialization is. In the world of businesses that sell a commodity, it's common to use the word positioning to describe the process of earning a market position. Something about that word, the common meaning of it, suggests speed, sort of like the speed with which we might pick up a chess piece and move it somewhere else on the chessboard. The word positioning also implies a high level of control and precision. as if we could download a desired market position into the minds of the people in the market. Those connotations tend to come with the word positioning, and that's why I've moved away from using that word positioning in the indie consultant context. You certainly do make a decision in our context about what market position you want for your business, but earning that market position takes time, and the resulting position/reputation is not entirely under your control. So when we use the word positioning, we suggest speed and precision. In reality, with us, we don't have that actual level of speed and precision. The reality for us, earning a market position is not at all like moving a chess piece on a chessboard. Rather, it is very simply making a decision about what reputation you want and then doing the work of earning that reputation. You specialize in what you want to be known for, and then you consistently implement that decision over the years that it generally takes to turn your decision into a market position or reputation. So positioning versus specialization is sort of focusing on the inputs versus the outputs or the outcomes. The input is the decision about how to specialize. The outcome is the market position. It's the reputation. It's being known for something. Recently, I had the fascinating experience of reading the book Working Backwards, which is a book about Amazon's management practices. And they have a real focus on meaningful inputs rather than outputs. Shortly after reading that book, I read Roger Martin describing how he, Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel, and Peter Drucker all kind of line up on the other side of this debate. And they are very focused on, I mean, not all of them are still alive, but their perspective, they're very focused on objectives and outcomes. Goals, objectives, outcomes. I love this kind of tension. And I think the same kind of tension or duality emerges when you look closely at a lot of questions. We end up suspended in a sort of intellectual hammock, and we see the value of two opposing approaches. And we draw on elements of both approaches in whatever way the situation at hand demands. Or maybe we synthesize these opposites into a third way. Likewise, I could see you focusing on the market position that you want to establish. That's the outcome. Or I could see you focusing on the inputs required to create that outcome. That's the decision about specialization and consistent implementation. Or I could see you focusing on both. My default is to say that for the indie consultant, a market position is a reputation. This focuses us on the accretive effect that consistent execution has. And emphasizing that consistent execution is almost always works out well for us, I think, especially in our context. In many ways, the difference between specializing and positioning is really a subtle difference in word meanings. At some level, it does not have any practical implications. But this is a Go Deep lecture, so it's the right place to go deep into this kind of deep nuance. And with this information, I hope you can make sense of whatever words someone else happens to be using in conversations about these topics. Hopefully it gives you enough context to understand what they might actually mean if they don't happen to use the word in the most precise way. Something that has much more significant practical implications is the contextual difference between a product and a service. So we're going to talk about that next. It is useful to think of the world of business as divided into two parts. The first part produces things, products or services, and those things can be sold at high levels of quality and consistency. Over time, things tend to evolve so that these products or services can be sold using scalable business models that are optimized to reach the broadest possible audience. That's the first part of the world of business. The second part produces things, again, they can be products or services, and these things combine customization and scarcity, and that's how they create value. These are often created by businesses that have hard constraints on their scalability. So these things are optimized to generate the highest possible profit. The best word for that first part of the business world is commodities. Economists define commodities as things that are fungible, meaning they're more or less completely interchangeable with alternatives. You make a cake for some people, they probably don't know or care what kind of flour you used in that cake, what kind of granulated sugar you used in it. Those are things that are fungible. That definition that economists use for commodities, they're fungible, is actually unhelpful to us because it ignores the business model and the historical evolutionary forces that are really an important part of understanding all this. It also confuses us about where to seek useful best practices about marketing. Commodities are often confused with a lack of what's called differentiation. Differentiation, or the lack thereof, does not make something a non-commodity or a commodity. Again, a commodity business uses a scalable business model to produce things that can be sold at high levels of quality and consistency at a price that allows it to reach the broadest possible market. Apple sells commodities. Shell Oil sells commodities. Accenture sells commodities. Chase Bank sells commodities. Stanley Steamer sells commodities. I really needed to make sure that Apple's on that list, and they belong there because they're often held up as an example of highly differentiated products. And that's not wrong. Their products are highly differentiated. But differentiation is not what makes something, differentiation or the lack thereof is not what makes something a commodity. It's those other attributes: scalable business model, products that can be sold at high levels of quality and consistency at a price that allows it to reach a broad market. That's what makes something a commodity. So Apple is just as much a commodity business as Shell Oil is. Keep this context in mind as we continue to discuss positioning and specialization. Positioning and specialization work differently in the commodity and non-commodity context. A good example of a commodity business is the software as a service business model. This might be one of the best examples of something that uses a scalable business model to produce things that can be sold at high levels of quality and consistency at a price that allows it to reach the broadest possible market. The cost of selling one more copy of the software, marginal cost, is so close to zero that these businesses are often just described that way. You'll hear folks like Ben Thompson, who's a tech industry analyst, refer to these businesses as zero marginal cost businesses. Like, that's such an essential quality of these kinds of businesses that it's often used as a sort of descriptor for the whole business. Software businesses show us something important about many, but not all, commodity businesses. The product is more flexible than humans tend to be. So a software product is more flexible than humans tend to be. Humans are adaptable, to be sure. That might be one of humanity's primary assets. But change takes time for us, especially at the individual level, maybe even more so at the societal level, but change takes time. Certain kinds of change are almost always difficult, slow changes for human beings. Software, on the other hand, can very quickly adapt. Maybe you remember in the year 2020 when Clubhouse got super popular super fast. It took less than 6 months for Twitter and Facebook to roll out competing audio chat features. How long would it take for a software developer, a human being, to become a well-known expert on WebRTC? That's the protocol that's used to deliver much of the world's real-time video and audio content. How long would it take that person to become an expert in that skill domain? How long would it take a consultant to become a well-known expert in any topic that has substantial depth and complexity? The implied answer that I hope you're filling in your mind is a lot longer than 6 months. You can become a deep expert in things in a number of years, maybe 2-3 years. But a lot of topics require more than that amount of time. And so I think this proves my point that change at the level of individual human beings generally takes time. Products, on the other hand, especially software products, can change much more quickly. You'll remember that idea that the word positioning implies speed and precision. We're talking about speed here and the difference between how that works in the product versus the individual human context. Another important difference. Products are often easy to understand directly. Services, on the other hand, are usually delivered in some version of de facto secrecy. If you're really interested in evaluating or buying a product, you can almost interact directly with the actual product before buying it. There are exceptions, obviously. If you're a government considering building a hydroelectric dam, you can't interact directly with that thing before it's built. But there are huge categories of the world of products where you can directly interact with the actual product, or one just like the one that you will buy. Maybe you remember when the original unibody aluminum MacBook Pros came out. It was possible to actually, physically interact with one of those computers and feel and experience the differences between that and the competing solutions from the PC side of the market at that time. You would notice how much more rigid and precise and sturdy the whole thing felt, and the hinges were just, again, precise and sturdy compared to the alternatives from the PC side, which felt a lot more kind of mushy and plasticky. This is inherent observability. With a product, you can just observe the thing directly. You can experience it. That's not possible with most services. In fact, services are usually delivered in some form of de facto secrecy. And it's not that we're trying to deliver the service in secret. It's just the nature of so many services that they are not delivered in the public view, even if there's not some sort of non-disclosure agreement involved. Services just tend to happen in some form of privacy or secrecy or away from public view. With products, you have another quality called trialability. So if you're considering using Salesforce in your business, you can sign up for an account, pay a little bit per month for it, and sort of kick the tires before you commit to rolling out Salesforce throughout your entire business. Now, on the services side of the world, some buyers will try to sort of engineer a free trial. A lot of times buyers of creative services try to extract free work from service providers as a way to kind of kick the tires, so to speak, and give that company a trial run. But executionally or architecturally complex projects really defeat the value of these kind of trials. There's so much complexity, so many ways things can go differently or wrong. It just makes services very difficult to, quote, try out. So that's another important difference between products and services. Evaluating the track record of a service provider would seem to be the next best alternative. Okay, you can't try them out in a way that would really represent the actual experience of working with this service provider, so let's check into their track record. That seems to be the next best alternative, but with services, those track records tend to be self-reported and therefore not very objective because they're filtered through, there's a bit of a conflict of interest there, right? Published social proof that the service provider might publish testimonials, quotes from previous clients, case studies, etc. That's usually pretty unobjective and distorted. And you can get person-to-person social proof, so you can ask around and see if someone has worked with this service provider before. And then you can ask them. And that is, I think, generally more trustworthy. It's not totally objective, but it's more trustworthy. But it's not a very scalable way for that company to prove that they can reliably complete whatever it is. Now, observability in the product world is not perfect. If we think back to Apple again, they had a number of years where they were shipping computers with objectively terrible keyboards that failed at an extremely high rate. And I don't think anyone will ever know how many of those failed and needed repair. Apple is certainly not going to come forward with that information. So there are places where observability in the product world is not perfect, but it's way better than it is in the services world in general. Another difference between the commodity and non-commodity, or the product and services context. We've already discussed the fact that in no case can you download or install a perception about a product, service, or company in the minds of everyone in the market. You just can't do this. Can't even do it with a single person's mind. You can't make them think what you want them to think about your business. But you can amplify and accelerate the spread of a marketing message, and you can do that with money. I mean, more specifically, with money and advertising is the typical way to do it. Not the only way, but the most common way. So you can use advertising, sponsorships. There are other ways too. You can use those tools and money to get a message in front of eyeballs or ears. Product companies tend to be more experienced with using money to amplify and accelerate a marketing message. They're more experienced with it than we indie consultants are. Now, it's not impossible for us to use money in this way, but we tend to be much less experienced in doing this, so we do it less. As a result, product companies are able to use advertising to more quickly inform a market about things that might lead to the formation of a desired market position. Product companies are generally more able to use money to quickly inform or teach the market about what their product is. If we go back to our metaphor of positioning as picking up a chess piece and moving it where we want it on the board, that metaphor applies more to a product than it does to services. Products have these attributes. They're more flexible than people are. They are relatively more observable. They are more trialable. You can try them out, kick the tires. And product companies are usually more able to amplify a marketing message using money. All of those things combine to make it so that you can position a product in the market sort of like you position a chess piece on the playing board. That ultimate level of speed and precision isn't there, but it is there more so with products than it is with services. It's not really possible to position a service in the same way. With the services of an indie consultant, you are gradually earning a reputation in the minds of those who participate in your target market. Establishing a market position for both products and services takes time, but it's more like years for a service. It could happen much more quickly with products. The idea of positioning did not spring fully formed from my forehead. This idea entered the mainstream of marketing in the 70s with the publication of a series of articles by Al Ries and Jack Trout. Those articles became a book titled Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind. That was published in 1981. If we step back a little bit from this and think about big ideas both do and don't have owners. The big enough ideas don't really have owners in any legal sense, but they do have people who generously, tirelessly share the idea. And those people tend to become thought of as the custodians or even the owners of the idea. And sometimes those people go too far and claim origination of an idea that they did not invent. Maybe their actual contribution was packaging and promoting the idea better than the actual inventors did. There's debate about who exactly pioneered and formalized this line of thinking about positioning. But I think there's less doubt about the impact that Ries and Trout's book has had and how it's established them as the sort of de facto owners of the positioning idea. Hopefully, there's no doubt at all in your mind that I did not invent this idea. And I hope I've contributed something worthwhile to clarifying how it works in the world of the indie consultant. I did not invent the idea. If you read Rees and Trout's book, you'll notice it's focused on the context of commodity businesses. It's pretty clearly claiming that what they call owning a word in the mind, or more fully, owning a word in the mind of the market. I think they pretty clearly claim that's a powerful route to market share dominance. There are, believe it or not, competing ideas about how commodity businesses obtain market share dominance. This idea of owning a word in the mind is not the only idea out there. One excellent competitor comes from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute for Marketing Science. The book titled How Brands Grow summarizes their research findings and the perspective that their research has led them to. When the Ehrenberg Bass folks look at buying behavior for commodity products, they find little to no relationship between Rees and Trout's word ownership and the things that commodity businesses care about, namely market penetration and growth of their company's bottom line. The Ehrenberg Bass folks find that even with brands that marketers think of as inspiring massive loyalty and emotional connection, Apple is a good example of that, they find in their research that actual consumers buy an ensemble of products, an assortment of products from a variety of brands in the category. This suggests that actual buying behavior is driven by something other than brand loyalty, and beyond that, something other than owning a word in the mind. The Ehrenberg Bass folks suggest that physical availability and brand distinctiveness, not differentiation or loyalty, are the levers that commodity brands should pull to achieve the kind of growth they seek. If you have slipped back into that old habit of equating commodity with undifferentiated, this is a good place for me to try to snap you out of that again. I'm talking about a particular business model when I talk about commodity businesses. Remember, Apple sells commodities, and what makes their products commodities is not differentiation or the lack thereof, but it's their ability to produce a consistent quality product at scale and reasonable price. Commodity businesses can increase their profit margin, but it's often easier for them to generate more dollars of profit by selling more units of the product or service that they sell. This exposes something really important, and it's why I'm so often harping on making sure that we're crystal clear about the context that we're talking about. Indie consultants, freelancers also, we have a hard cap on our production capacity. So if we're underutilized, meaning we're not billing as many hours or selling as much of our capacity as we could be, the easiest way for us to generate more dollars of profit is by selling that underutilized capacity. This makes us, in that specific context, like a commodity business where the goal is to sell more units of the product or service. But once the indie consultant or freelancer reaches that hard cap on our production capacity, our business model either needs to change to an agency model where we keep selling more capacity by adding staff, people, or we need to find ways to generate more dollars of profit with a fixed production capacity, if that's 40 hours a week or whatever amount that we can work, sell to clients, etc. We can't increase that capacity, so what we need to do is find ways to use that fixed capacity to generate more dollars of profit. This is huge. It means that Trout and Rees's advice about having a narrow focus is actually more applicable to us than it is to the audience they wrote the book for. And that was the audience, again, of commodity businesses. Trout and Rees, in the end, I think are picking examples to support an inductive model. The Ehrenberg Bass folks are deductively working from data. Those are two different approaches to the same sort of set of questions. And I'm not sure which perspective has had more impact on the world of business. But aside from how this impinges on our discussion of positioning and specialization for the indie consultant, it's a really interesting example of how thought leadership works. If you find any of this stuff interesting, by the way, this particular discussion about Ehrenberg Bass and Troughton Rees, check out the book Anatomy of Humbug. This book takes a historical view of the advertising industry, and it gets a little bit nerdy in places, but it shows you how that industry has produced at least a half dozen different models or theories about how advertising might actually work. I find the models interesting, but it's also very interesting to see how ideas get from inception to acceptance to doctrine. Why specialize? There are two main reasons to do this. First, it makes your business more valuable. Second, it creates marketing efficiencies. To understand this a bit more, it helps if we talk about marketing in general a bit. Marketing is earning visibility and trust for your service offerings, business, or thinking. There are other definitions, of course, for marketing. Seth Godin might describe it rather poetically as changing the culture. Peter Drucker wrote, "The aim of marketing is to make selling superfluous. The aim of marketing is to know and understand your customer so well that the product or service fits him and sells itself." The American Marketing Association has a definition. Marketing is the process of planning and executing the conception, pricing, promotion, and distribution of ideas, goods, and services to create exchanges that satisfy individual and organizational goals. There's something valuable in all these definitions, but they range from very abstract to very specific. If we go for a middle ground, I think we end up pretty close to my definition. Marketing is earning visibility and trust for your service offerings, business, or thinking. Marketing is plagued by inefficiencies. I'll often say, most of the time, marketing just doesn't work. There are reasons why, and they have to do with how humans respond by default to marketing in general or a marketing message. The default response of a human being to seeing your website or other artifacts of your marketing is to misunderstand it or ignore it. The default response of a human being to hearing what you do for a living is to quickly forget it. The default response of a prospective client to hearing about what you can do for them is to not trust you. These are the defaults that are wired into human behavior. It's these defaults that cause most marketing to fail. This is what I mean by marketing inefficiencies. Each of the three human behavioral defaults I just described has an inverse quality that can actually be helpful, that can cause our marketing to work rather than to fail. So if we recognize and work with these inverse qualities, our attempts to earn visibility and trust from prospective clients can avoid failure. They can actually work. Here are those inverse qualities. The default response of a human who's a member of a social group is to treat other members of their social group better than outsiders. The default response of a human who has a problem that they are aware of is to be on high alert for a solution to that problem. The more important and urgent the problem, the greater that solution awareness is. The default response of a human who encounters another human with high perceived status is to treat that high status human better than lower status humans. Specialization makes your efforts to earn visibility more efficient in several ways. When you specialize, you become something of an insider to an industry vertical, an audience, or some functional area of the business world. Especially if you specialize in some sort of evergreen business problem or functional area of the business world, you can benefit from the solution-seeking behavior that humans default to. Third, specialization often makes your message about what you do or the value of what you do more memorable, shareable, and discoverable. Specialization makes it dramatically easier to conceive of who you are trying to reach and that creates some positive effects. For example, if you're using outbound marketing, your outbound marketing can become much more relevant, which will make it more effective most of the time. So as soon as you decide who your services are for, you can communicate more effectively with those prospects. Part of that is just because you are more of an insider to their world. Overall, we could summarize, we could say focus is necessary to create relevance, and relevance is a prerequisite to visibility. Specialization is the decision to focus. Specialization also makes your efforts to earn trust more efficient. When you specialize, again, you become an insider to industry vertical and audience, a functional area of the business world. This is beneficial for visibility, for making it possible for prospective clients to discover you and know about you. It also helps with your efforts to earn trust, because humans treat insiders to their social group better than outsiders. They, by default, tend to trust them a bit more. When you specialize, your narrow focus becomes a force multiplier on your ability to cultivate expertise. Western cultures confer elevated social status on experts. Experts are almost always specialized. So this creates a sort of heuristic, a mental shortcut. So when we see a specialist, we make the assumption that they possess valuable expertise, and that leads us to trust them more because of that expertise. Whether they actually have the expertise, we don't know, but we use these sorts of mental shortcuts all the time. If there's more demand for your expertise than there is supply, then choosing and sticking with a narrow focus sets you up to make more money than you would as a generalist. We should talk about expertise a bit. It's difficult to define precisely. Let's try anyway. I'll start with my own somewhat poetic definition, where I'll contrast skill and expertise. Skill gets it done. Expertise creates business impact. If we try to incorporate a little more prose, a little less poetry, expertise guides the deployment of skill. So skill knows how to do it, whatever it is. Expertise decides what to do and knows why and when to do it. Expertise guides, informs, or improves decision-making, especially at the level of business or product strategy. Expertise reduces uncertainty in decision-making, or it offers a methodology to reduce uncertainty in decision-making. Expertise improves business outcomes in ways that skill alone cannot, because expertise incorporates more context than skill does. Expertise can be a sort of force multiplier for skill. Expertise helps you predict and prevent or manage the second-order consequences of applied skill or other causes of change. Expertise prevents unassisted skill from causing harm. The output of applied expertise is business impact. The output of abstracted expertise is best practices or other forms of intellectual property. Intellectual property in the world of services, by the way, is expertise that's packaged and made usable by non-experts. Our world needs a lot of both skill and expertise. Skill alone can be very valuable, but its value changes over time, and we need to understand what causes that. Something about the combination of humans and technology creates a historical evolutionary force known as commoditization. Maybe it's an outcome of capitalism, maybe it's something that would happen even if capitalism wasn't in the picture. But either way, commoditization is the eighth wonder of the world. Commoditization is related to the commodity business model I talked about earlier, but it is not the same thing. Commoditization is the evolution of any form of technology from novel, chaotic, and unstandardized to well-known, stable, and standardized. So the technology, we think of that as technology maturing. It starts out as novel, unpredictable, chaotic, not standardized at all. It starts out as prototypes. But it evolves over time, especially as it's adopted more widely, and it becomes well-known, stable, and standardized. This is commoditization. It is an evolution from one state to another. This evolution can include technology at any scale, from small bits of technology like transistors to significant platforms like operating systems, to industry practices, sort of soft forms of technology like how you manage people and projects and so forth. This evolution has produced incredible amounts of value for humanity. Commoditization is why an iPhone has more computing power than a Cray supercomputer from the 1980s. It's why you can buy a battery for almost any gadget that doesn't already have a built-in battery, and you can do so at any drugstore or hardware store. The list goes on and on. Commoditization has produced tremendous value. For humanity, it is a good thing. Expertise is like the human skin. It has 3 layers. There is the outer layer, the epidermis of expertise, and that's like the outer layer of human skin. It's thin and mostly dead. The dermis of expertise lies underneath that outer layer. It's much thicker, and cultivating this next layer of expertise takes more time and effort. The hypodermis of expertise is the deepest layer. It is thicker still, and it is the domain, when it comes to expertise, of true mastery. As you move deeper into expertise, you get better at incorporating an understanding of context, nuance, and the range and diversity of real-world problems into your expertise. So your expertise becomes more nuanced, more sophisticated. Your models by which you understand the world become better as you discard the old ones and update them with new nuance, detail, context, range, and diversity of what happens in the real world. As you move deeper into expertise, you would also incorporate complementary forms of expertise into your own. And this allows you to deliver a solution that works within the context, nuance, and diversity of real-world problems. We can think of specialization like a hypodermic needle that's attached to a syringe. The needle is very narrow, and this allows us to penetrate into the dermis and ultimately the hypodermis of some kind of problem where we would like to deliver value. The barrel of the syringe contains a sort of, quote, medicine. It incorporates multiple components that support and complement the active ingredient, which is our core expertise. So to create business impact, we need both the narrow focus of specialization and the somewhat broader formulation of an active ingredient, our primary expertise, combined also with other supporting ingredients, secondary disciplines that we learn about in order to support our primary expertise. Again, commoditization is the evolution of any form of technology from novel, chaotic, and unstandardized to well-known, stable, standardized. As this process unfolds, skill gets absorbed into the design of products, processes, and systems. Skill, knowing how to do things, gets baked into the cake. This means that as things commoditize, the value of skill diminishes because it's not a separate thing that's needed to make the technology useful. It's baked right into it. Now, the value of skill doesn't go down to 0, of course. Some forms of skill are always needed to make use of whatever the technology is, but when the technology is young, skill alone is much more valuable than it is 7 to 10 years down the line when the technology has matured into a more commoditized form. It is difficult to develop valuable expertise without specializing. Specialization helps us focus, and that focus helps us penetrate the epidermis of expertise. Then we get to start working with more complex, challenging problems. That puts pressure on us to really understand nuance and context. That puts pressure on us to recruit complementary forms of expertise And that allows us to deliver a robust, complete solution that works in the real world with complex, nuanced, real-world problems. If we don't specialize, we stay at the surface. And that means we are dealing with relatively simple problems where skill alone is sufficient. The problem we then face is that the value of skill alone declines as the things we have skill in commoditize. That thing could be almost anything. It could be a small piece of technology, a larger system like a software product, or a human system like a management process or framework. If we don't move beyond skill alone, then the value of our skill set declines, and we have to respond by upgrading, enriching, or replacing that skill set. This is a big part of why I view specialization as such an important investment in the lifelong value of a career. And it's why I hope we all will specialize in a way that leads us to real expertise. Despite my enthusiasm for specialization, it does remain a somewhat rare choice. I don't have great data on this, but I would say across the landscape of services, maybe 20% are specialized. I think it's unfortunate that it's rare, because that's our main opportunity to develop really valuable expertise, but I definitely understand why it's a less common choice despite these benefits. In fact, I think there are three pretty good reasons why specialization is rare. The first is that it's emotionally frightening. The second is that technology is constantly changing and constantly creating little bubble effects, little economic bubble effects. And you can do pretty well by riding those bubbles. Third, we practice an unlicensed profession. So we have to invent or discover a viable path to specialization ourselves. There's no infrastructure in the profession to do it for us. Lawyers and doctors, to name two licensed professions, have pretty clear paths to specialization that are laid out in the infrastructure of their profession. Unlicensed professionals like us mostly lack those kinds of roadmaps. There is a basket of related fears that often emerge when indie consultants and freelancers are considering specializing. I spend a fair bit of time discussing these in the Go Fast version of this course, so I'll just lightly touch on the fear here. We overestimate the potential for harm when we're specializing. This makes it seem more dangerous than it actually is to specialize. We also overestimate the permanence of the decision, and so we fail to notice all the ways we can tweak and improve the decision, especially in the early parts of our implementation of that decision. We also fear that boredom will accompany specialization. You already know that the cultivation of real expertise involves a kind of focused, intentional regeneralization after you've specialized. And you probably already know that being self-employed involves a real diversity of day-to-day tasks. And I think that means your actual life is never going to be monotonous as long as you're self-employed. And specialization poses no risk of making it monotonous. Additionally, imposter syndrome often crops up when we think about being a highly paid expert. We don't have the external validation of a licensed profession to support us, so our sense of value either comes from within us or from seeing an excess of demand for our specialized services. Before we've actually developed that expertise, it's difficult for some of us to imagine the future marketplace demand that will be the source of our future confidence. So we kind of get stuck in some form of imposter syndrome. In a situation that features uncertainty about potential gains or losses, it's easier for us to focus on what we might lose than what we might gain. If we're specializing, we have real clarity on what we're giving up. We have much less clarity about what it's actually like to operate as an actual expert. So a lot of our attention goes to what we will lose or give up and what we might lose. And that can cause us to avoid specialization. Finally, a lot of the fear I've described here doesn't arise while we're thinking about our options for specializing. It arises right at the moment that we move from making the decision to implementing the decision. The implementation starts to feel kind of icky. And so what's natural is for us to think, oh, I have made a bad decision. I'm going to loop back to that decision-making process and try to make a better decision. That's not what's actually happening. It's just that the implementation is necessarily intimidating and scary because for most of us it's quite novel. It can also be the case that we move into the implementation mode, we stick with the original decision, we don't revisit it, but we move into implementation in a very sort of tentative, hesitant mode. In both cases, we probably have not made a bad decision, and we won't actually know until we implement the decision anyway. We have a lot more flexibility to tweak or update the decision than we think. And so a sort of hesitant, quiet, reserved implementation will harm us far more than a less than perfect decision would. Courage is being aware of your fear and moving forward anyway. I hope that describing the fear the way I have here helps you understand it, helps you realize it's very normal, and helps you move forward anyway. I'll more fully define platforms a bit later in this lecture, but for now, know that a platform is a thing that lots of businesses use, and they often need help understanding, managing, and fixing those platforms. Platforms are often technology systems, but they can also be management systems or frameworks like Agile or Scrum. Successful platforms create little economic bubbles around themselves. Most of these bubbles are temporary, but temporary in this context means 3 to 5 years. And so you having good timing combined with a willingness to jump from platform to platform as they mature, that can make for above average earning potential over the course of a career. There is risk and effort required to do this kind of jumping from platform to platform. It's not a free lunch. But the ability to profit from these little economic bubbles caused by platforms might be the single best argument against specialization. Of course, when you focus on a platform, you are specializing, but you're specializing in a particular way that leaves you more vulnerable to change than other types of specialization would. Again, I'll elaborate more on the risks associated with platforms a bit later in this lecture. Again, specialization is somewhat rare because of the fear, because specializing in a platform can be a good alternative to a more entrepreneurial specialization, and because we practice an unlicensed profession, and so we have to invent our own path to a viable and successful specialization. Those are really the 3 main factors that make specialization rare. There are 5 ways you can specialize. We can group these into 2 categories, and this is an overview. I'll drill into each one specifically in a moment. The vertical specializations include focusing on a vertical and focusing on an audience. The horizontal specializations include focusing on a horizontal business problem or focusing on a platform. And then there's a 5th way of specializing called service specialization. I should say now, none of these ways of specializing is inherently better. They're all trade-offs of different opportunities and risks. One way to break the massive world of business down into smaller pieces is to group organizations that sell the same kind of thing together. And we group those into what are known as market verticals. The examples you see on this illustration represent just a few of the market verticals out there. On our simplified map of the market here, we've got finance, manufacturing, medical, science, and education. The North American Industry Classification System, or the NAICS or the NAICS system, is the most prevalent system for defining market verticals. In that system, there are 20 top-level categories and 422 bottom-level subcategories. So top-level categories are big, broad industries like finance, manufacturing, and so on. The bottom-level subcategories are highly specific subcategories. They range in size from 8 establishments, which is the household laundry equipment manufacturing category, to 246,888 establishments, and that's the full-service restaurants category. When you specialize in serving a single market vertical, or maybe two closely related market verticals, you have a pure vertical specialization. An audience is a group of businesses that might not exist within the same market vertical, but they share some other fundamental similarity, like they share a mission, a need, a desire, a business model. They share something important in common. Their fundamental similarity will often extend to a shared worldview or some sort of narrative they have about what's important. And it's this that allows you to more easily earn visibility and trust from them as a group. The needs, desires, watering holes, and cultural institutions that an audience shares makes specializing in an audience a viable way to specialize. On this simplified map of the market, we have startups, businesses with bilingual customers, nonprofits, e-commerce businesses, and purpose-driven businesses. Each of these categories of business will share something important in common with each other, and this commonality brings them together in a way that makes it easier for someone who decides to specialize in that audience to earn visibility and trust from those businesses. Pure vertical and audience specializations share some potential opportunities with each other, some ways in which these forms of specialization are particularly advantageous. The first is that they're easy. Outbound marketing, integrating with the sort of infrastructure of an industry vertical, things like conferences, major publications, etc., those form the industry infrastructure. It's easier with vertical specialization. The way word of mouth spreads through a vertical is another opportunity. When people ask for referrals, they will tend to ask others who are in the same industry vertical. That is because that's where most people's professional network is the strongest and most dense. Word of mouth spreads vertically, people spread vertically too. The professional network concentration that is usually vertically concentrated for most people, it helps them get a new job when they leave the old job. And this tends to cause them to land at another company in the same vertical. And that potentially opens up new opportunity for you at this new client. If your point of contact moves from company A to company C is likely to be in the same vertical, and it's possible, maybe even likely, that they sort of take you with them to their new company. Vertical specialization sounds boring. It's not. But the idea of focusing on a single market vertical just sounds boring, especially to folks who really thrive on novelty. And that's a lot of us. If you can see past that false fear about boredom, which we talked about, I think, pretty extensively already, vertical specialization can be a moat. It can be a competitive advantage because this perception that it's boring will repel less wise and ambitious business owners. Vertical specialization may make it easier, often does make it easier to forge strategic partnerships with other firms that are practicing different disciplines. So maybe you're focused on marketing. There are other firms that might serve the same vertical and provide accounting or legal services or who knows what else. Those other firms that are specialized in the same vertical can become strategic partners. You can refer business to each other, basically. It's also easier to connect with super connectors within the vertical, people like podcasters, people who run business associations or organize conferences, and product vendors as well, specialized SaaSes. These are all part of the ecosystem of other vendors who may be focused on the same vertical you are, and you can help each other out. And it becomes easier to do that if you're an insider to that world. Vertical specialization also shortens the path from skill to expertise. By serving a group of businesses that have a lot in common with each other, you'll find more opportunity and incentive to become conversant in what's important to those businesses. And that will allow you to more quickly learn how to create real impact in the context of that vertical. Vertical specializations are not without some risks you should consider. Remember, every form of specialization is just a different set of trade-offs. Not every vertical is equally receptive to outsiders. If you decide to specialize in a vertical because you have a head start there, some sort of advantageous level of access or credibility, then you won't start as an outsider. But if you start as an outsider, or if you are an outsider, some verticals will not be so hospitable to you at first. The verticals that tend to be inhospitable to outsiders are often that way because they function like closed systems. That means they feature lots of centralized ownership and control. They are ask permission, not forgiveness environments. Some people thrive in this kind of environment, but if that's not you, then you can add this to the list of risks that are associated with a pure vertical specialization. Again, not all verticals function like closed systems, but some of them do, and so be aware of this potential risk. The year 2007 would have been a pretty bad year for anyone who decided to specialize in the real estate, mortgage, or construction verticals. The COVID pandemic created two extremely challenging years for the travel, hospitality, and restaurant verticals. These are examples of how verticals are vulnerable to localized downturns. No vertical is immune to a downturn, and downturns are not necessarily fatal for your business, but they are a risk that comes with vertical specialization. Every form of specialization requires some amount of maturity and seriousness in your approach to your business. I think vertical specialization ultimately requires that you care about business results, people, or a certain kind of business that's within your area of focus, and you have to care about that stuff as much or more than you care about your technical skill set. Some people will reject prioritizing people over expertise, and for them, vertical specialization might be extra risky. It is possible, though very unlikely, that you will find client-side concerns about conflict of interest if you pursue a vertical specialization. I can count on one hand the number of vertically specialized clients I've worked with who actually had conflict of interest concerns raised by their prospects. It can happen, it's quite unlikely, and if a prospect does raise this concern, it can often be easily dismissed by focusing on your expertise and professionalism. As we discuss these risks, please don't lose perspective. Every way of specializing is a trade-off. So as you think about the risks, don't lose sight of the opportunities and the benefits. Those are often merely the flip side of the risks. In other words, there's no free lunch, but don't over-focus on the risks and forget about the potential upside. Horizontal specialization is focusing on a type of technology or evergreen business problem. And when you do this, you have little or no concern for what vertical the problem shows up in. This is a type of specialization that focuses mostly on problems that are visible to business decision makers. On our simplified map of the market here, we've got employee morale, enterprise agility, legacy software, cloud security, and inventory management. These are pure horizontal specializations. Remember how commoditization bakes skill into the cake. That means that some horizontal specializations will have boom-bust dynamics if they're particularly susceptible to this aspect of commoditization. Think about GDPR compliance, for example, and think about companies forced to hold events online because of COVID. And then ask yourself, will these problems require expertise delivered through custom consulting services, or will they be adequately addressed by commoditized expertise that's baked into software or provided as best practices? Of course, the answer is both. A company like Facebook will certainly require specialized, customized GDPR expertise. And a company like Salesforce will prefer specialized, customized online events expertise. But the other 99% of the market, at least at the time of this recording, it's an open question as to how much of the demand for expertise can be satisfied with good enough commoditized solutions for both of those questions, GDPR and online events. The other form of horizontal specialization is to focus on a platform. A platform is a thing. It's often, but not always, a product that lots of businesses use and need help understanding. They need help planning for it, they need help implementing it, operating it, extending it, supporting it, fixing it, optimizing it, and upgrading it. A platform can be any number of things. It can be a business process framework. Maybe you've heard of the entrepreneurial operating system or Six Sigma, Agile, Lean, test-driven development. Those are all business process frameworks that we would think of as platforms. A platform could be a programming language, Python, Ruby, C#. A platform could be a software framework, React, Vue.js, Laravel. And a platform, finally, could be an actual software or technology platform you can build things on, like Amazon Web Services, Linux, Windows, Salesforce. In our simplified map of the market here, we have the entrepreneurial operating system, the React JavaScript framework, Amazon Web Services, Salesforce, and the StoryBrand marketing framework. These are all pretty popular platforms today. The horizontal approach to specialization has several unique opportunities. Lots of us have worked very hard to cultivate our skill and expertise, and we see few limits to where that expertise can be useful. If this is how we see the world, then specializing horizontally is a very natural fit with our worldview. It is easier for the typical consultant to imagine how horizontal specialization will remain an interesting, deep challenge for them over time. I don't think it's actually true that horizontal specialization is inherently more interesting than vertical, but it seems to be true because of the aforementioned way that we're used to thinking about things. We're used to thinking about our expertise as this thing that can be applied very broadly in all sorts of businesses, and sometimes that's true. The fact that we might see the world this way lowers the emotional barriers to entry for a horizontal market position. I'm not sure I can prove this, but I believe horizontal specialization, or a very narrow horizontal focus coupled with a somewhat more broad vertical focus, I believe this is a more suitable specialization model for the so-called lone wolves, the independent consultant, solo consultants who work on their own. They have no desire to build a team or agency business. The pure vertical focus generally deploys a pretty broad discipline. For example, marketing, management consulting, custom software development. So with the pure vertical focus, you have this broad discipline focused on a specific vertical, but the breadth of the discipline itself really benefits from a team of people with a blend of capabilities. For example, sure, there are developers with competence in full stack software development, design, user experience design, user interface design, DevOps, and all the other sub-disciplines needed to ship a software product. I've worked with quite a few folks. You particularly see this example in the world of embedded systems. And these are people who can handle everything from printed circuit board design to mechanics and motor system design, embedded real-time software, and they can single-handedly get something as complex as a drone or a surgery robot from idea to prototype. These are really impressive people. However, they're rare. A team of subspecialists in a lot of cases might offer a better value proposition for a client, especially if you're promising something like custom software for manufacturing. Again, that's a pure vertical focus with a pretty broad discipline. A lone wolf could credibly live up to the promise of something like inventory optimization for manufacturing. They would not necessarily need the support of a team of subspecialists with complementary skills. So again, a more narrow horizontal focus coupled with a somewhat more broad vertical focus is likely for a lot of independent consultants to be a more suitable specialization model. Or alternately, just going narrow along both the vertical and horizontal axes. One of the most fundamental differences between vertical and horizontal specialization is the relative absence of external signals of buying intent from clients that have some kind of business problem they need to solve. Often, not always, but often, the situations that need a horizontally specialized expert are not very visible from the outside of the company. That means that when you're horizontally specialized, your prospects need to find you because it's hard to find them. Methods like outbound marketing are less likely to be effective with a pure horizontal specialization. This can make marketing a horizontal specialization more difficult. And I'm not implying that outbound marketing is the only or best method, but it can be a really useful method when you're trying to bootstrap something quickly. And not having access to that method when you're horizontally specialized, or just knowing that it's going to be less effective, makes the overall marketing challenge somewhat more difficult. Those of you paying close attention may notice that I almost always suggest having some kind of vertical focus. Even if you have a pure horizontal focus, having at least a broad vertical focus. Part of the reason for that is it partially solves this problem, not completely, but at least it gives you a target to aim at if you're doing outbound marketing, and a way to speak in a way that's going to be more relevant and more sort of insidery to the vertical that you've added to your narrow horizontal specialization. That's why I'm almost always, trying to kind of nudge you in that direction. It really makes life easier. There certainly are great examples of people who have a pure horizontal specialization, no vertical focus, or no defined vertical focus, and it works out great. You can make that work. But in terms of looking at this from a sort of beginner perspective, having some kind of vertical focus really helps. After you find them or they find you, if you're horizontally focused, you may be in for a longer sales cycle or an unpredictable or just kind of weird sales process. And when I say weird, I just mean it's different from client to client. It's hard to predict. Horizontal specialists often, but not always, specialize in business problems that are a bit idiosyncratic. There's no sort of commoditized solution for those problems, and that's what makes them opportunities. But that can also make the buying process more idiosyncratic, and it can require more effort and patience to navigate that buying process. Another risk with horizontal specializations, it can be very easy to confuse the technical difficulty of the solution with the economic value of the solution. Just because a solution is difficult to create, or is difficult to deliver, or is otherwise rare in some way, does not automatically make it valuable to clients. This is the same problem that's at the root of so many failed startups and business ideas. And it's always a bit heartbreaking to see it, but it's best to go in knowing how much clients actually value the solution rather than just saying, well, this was difficult to do, therefore it must be valuable. That doesn't always hold. There's probably, in fact, more examples of this was difficult to do and nobody cares than there are this was difficult to do and that makes it valuable. Now, sometimes with a horizontal specialization, there's not a lot of consulting demand, but there is a lot of demand from your peers to acquire this skill or expertise that you've cultivated. And so we can serve that demand from our peers with productized, lower cost versions of the expertise delivered through books, courses, etc., mentoring, coaching. And that can add significant revenue or allow you to build a whole new business doing just that. So there are cases where, from the consulting perspective, the demand is pretty low, pretty unimpressive, but there's a lot more demand from your peers to learn the thing, whatever it is. So you can sometimes make enough money serving that secondary demand. You have heard me reference platform specialization several times already. I want to spend a little time focused on the unique opportunity and risk that a platform specialization poses. I'm going to describe a process that generally takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So maybe think of this as a 7-year process in most cases. Think also of this as a process that is divided into 2 phases. During the first phase of this process, the platform owner seeks to build what Jeffrey Moore referred to as a whole product ecosystem. This was in his influential book, Crossing the Chasm. A whole product ecosystem is the platform and the best practices, documentation, training, and the vendor ecosystem needed for conservative, risk-averse businesses to decide to adopt the platform. During the early days of a really popular, fast-rising platform, the platform owner has their hands full with just keeping the wheels on while they are building and growing the platform. If you, an independent consultant, show up and contribute any of the parts of this whole product ecosystem that they are currently missing, the platform owner will hoist you on their shoulders and give you and your contributions to their ecosystem as much visibility as they can. They will send you leads, they will give you opportunities to speak and write, and they will amplify those things, and they will give you opportunities to earn visibility and trust in all sorts of ways. At a certain point, this whole product ecosystem will be pretty well filled out. It will be good enough to meet the platform owner's needs. Then things change, and the platform owner seeks to do one of two things. The first thing they might try to do, they seek to commoditize their complements. Gasoline, diesel, and electricity are complements to the automobile. It works really well for automobile makers if gasoline, diesel, and electricity are cheap, highly standardized, and available everywhere. Salesforce agencies are complements to the Salesforce platform. It works really well for Salesforce if Salesforce agencies are relatively cheap, highly standardized, and available everywhere. Commodities, in other words. Do you see the problem for someone who has been running a Salesforce agency since the early days of Salesforce? Their main problem around the time this change occurs is that they need to reinvent their business from an innovation business model to an efficiency business model. This is a very difficult transition. The second thing a platform owner may decide to do, when they see growth start to level off, which it inevitably does, they start to look around for other revenue opportunities. They might squeeze their distribution channel, and if they've made agencies a part of their distribution strategy, HubSpot would be an example of this, then they will squeeze agencies to boost numbers. They may start to vertically integrate by adding a services division. That makes them your de facto competitor. And their claims might sound a little bit like this. Hey, we provide services and we also make the software. So we've got a direct line to the engineering team in case anything comes up. That's a tough differentiator to compete against. Remember all the harping I did earlier in this lecture about the commodity business model. It's not a lack of differentiation that makes something a commodity. It's an ability to produce the thing that's being sold at high levels of quality, consistency, and at a price that is accessible to the market. Running a commodity service business can be quite profitable. There's nothing strategically inferior about deciding to run that kind of business. The problem that a platform specialization creates is the problem of a forced evolution from an innovative business to a commodity business. In the first phase of a platform's life cycle, the platform owner encourages and rewards innovation businesses because that helps the platform owner build out best practices, documentation, training, and a vendor ecosystem. And it needs all those things for, again, what Jeffrey Moore calls the whole product ecosystem. Once that whole product ecosystem exists, the platform owner switches their strategic priority to deeper monetization. They might not do this right away. They might enjoy a few more years of strong growth, but when they see a reduction in the growth rate, they pretty predictably change to the deeper monetization strategy. And that causes them to seek to commoditize their complements or compete with their vendors in their ecosystem. That puts pressure on the innovation business. They can respond to that pressure by evolving into a commodity efficiency business. But that's an extremely difficult evolution, and it's one that most innovation business owners just don't want to undertake. This is the main risk trade-off we see with platform specialization. The fifth kind of specialization is service specialization. Service specialization is where you specialize your service delivery in some way. And it's often synonymous with productization. That's where you standardize the scope and pricing of a service. One of my favorite examples of service specialization is an outfit called Worst of All Design. And they offer a one-day business branding service. The design of their productized service, along with how the service itself is branded, appeals to a really narrow range of prospects. And this makes it easier for their service to gain visibility in the part of the market that's a good fit for their service. A multidimensional specialization is one where you have a narrow focus along both the vertical and horizontal axes. I should mention, this is a Go Deep lecture after all, there's really no such thing as a pure vertical specialization. So in a theoretically absolutely pure vertical specialization, you would focus on a market vertical and then have no other form of specialization along the horizontal axis. And that means technically you would provide anything that any company in that vertical could possibly need, from janitorial services to executive succession planning. No company is going to be that general. It doesn't exist. There's always an implied horizontal focus, but even with a pure vertical specialization, that implied horizontal focus can be really broad, like we do marketing or we do management consulting. Those are quite broad. It's much more likely that we're going to have something more narrow than that along the horizontal axis. But when you get super specific about vertical and horizontal at the same time, you have a multidimensional specialization. For almost any services company, there's going to be both a vertical and horizontal focus at play. Marketing for manufacturing, Salesforce consulting for medical, cloud security consulting for finance. Those are three examples of both a vertical and a horizontal focus. When we have a multidimensional specialization with a very narrow focus along both the horizontal and vertical dimensions, it can feel intimidating. We worry about the market not being big enough. But as long as it is big enough, the very narrow focus will usually have positive effects on our ability to earn trust and visibility. There's also some amount of implied or actual vertical focus at play, even in a pure horizontal specialization. For example, a pure horizontal specialization in inventory management is going to mostly exclude pure digital companies like software as a service, and largely exclude services companies, professional services companies, agencies, etc. Companies where inventory management is important but not a core strategic competency are probably going to be overrepresented in this pure horizontal specialist's client roster. So this creates a broad vertical focus that is more implied than explicitly stated in this consultant's declared focus. And that's totally normal. The short way of saying a lot of this is almost every specialization is multidimensional in some way. It may be an implied, vertical or horizontal focus, but it's almost always going to be, almost any specialization that works is going to be multidimensional in some way. It's the combination of really narrow focus along both vertical and horizontal dimensions that really earns the name multidimensional specialization. Let's review the big ideas from this lecture. While it has some things in common with brand and branding, I think that for the small solo service provider, the best way to think about positioning is to think of it as the process of earning a reputation. Being focused and intentional about how we do this elevates our reputation from the accidental byproduct of doing good work to a strategic initiative that builds a business asset for us. We build the reputation, the market position that we want by specializing in one of 5 ways. All of these combine some level of vertical and horizontal market focus. When we're thinking about all this positioning and specialization stuff, we need to be aware of what context we're operating within. And there are several important fundamental contexts. One contextual spectrum runs from commodity businesses on one end to, on the other end, businesses that sell things that cannot be standardized and sold profitably at large scale. This spectrum is 100% about business model, and 0% about whether the thing being sold is differentiated or not. Product businesses are almost always commodity businesses. Services businesses are sometimes commodity businesses and sometimes not. And service businesses operated by solo business people like us are almost never commodity businesses. Understanding the commodity versus non-commodity context helps us make sense of so much of the constellation of advice out there about positioning. A commodity business in pursuit of scale may use narrow focus as a bootstrapping strategy, but they will ultimately need to relax that narrow focus as they pursue scale. A non-commodity business operated by a single owner-operator, I'm assuming that's you, cannot pursue scale in terms of sales volume, so we need to pursue profitability instead. That means we need to maintain our narrow focus over the long term and use that to earn the kind of visibility and trust that gets us access to really profitable work. All right, that's it. We've explored in real depth here the big ideas that I hope help you fully understand positioning, specialization, and how those concepts work for the small solo services business. Thank you for your thoughtful consideration of these ideas.